Ukraine's war, the elusiveness of victory. The war in Ukraine stands as the largest armed conflict in Europe since World War II. This complex war has roots stretching back centuries and involves ethnic, linguistic, economic, political, and cultural dimensions. Ukraine and Russia share intertwined histories, cultures, and demographics. Modern-day Ukraine traces its origins to Kievan Rus, an Eastern Slavic state dating to the 9th century centered in Kiev. Over the centuries, parts of Ukraine were controlled at various times by Russia and Poland. Ukraine was a core constituent republic of the Soviet Union until its dissolution in 1991. Ukraine has a linguistically diverse population. For the 2001 census, around 17% of Ukrainians identified Russian as their native language, though some estimates are higher. Russian speakers are concentrated primarily in eastern and southern regions of Ukraine. This demographic complexity fuels tensions between Ukraine's government and its Russian-speaking population, especially in separatist-held areas. Discrimination against Russian speakers has surfaced in Ukraine, notably in language laws, education, and access to services. Ukrainian is the sole official language, which has marginalized Russian speakers. However, in recent years the government has passed anti-discrimination laws and promoted tolerance between linguistic groups. Tensions remain, but progress is being made. Economics has a key role. Ukraine has abundant natural resources like iron ore, coal, and fertile farmland that Russia covets. Its pipelines deliver Russian gas exports to Europe, giving Ukraine economic leverage. Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, gaining full control of these exports and offshore energy reserves and sparking international condemnation. Historically, Crimea was part of Russia until its transfer to Ukraine in 1954. Its majority ethnic Russian population and strategic value fueled the annexation crisis. Ukraine's political upheaval in 2014 proved pivotal. Pro-democracy protests erupted over President Yanukovych suspending an EU association agreement in favor of closer Russia ties. Yanukovych was ousted, soon followed by Russia's takeover of Crimea. Armed conflict broke out in 2014 in the Donbas region between Ukraine and Russian-backed separatists. Several factors fueled this war in eastern Ukraine. Political instability, alleged Russian support of rebels, ethnic divisions, and economic woes. Despite ceasefires, the Donbas war continues, displacing millions of Ukrainians. The Minsk agreements aim to de-escalate the eastern Ukraine conflict, but implementing these complex accords has proven very challenging. Issues like minimal trust between sides, debates over Russia's role, lack of international pressure, and unresolved core disputes have hindered the peace process. The West largely views Russia's actions in Ukraine as breaches of sovereignty and law meriting sanctions. Russia claims it is defending ethnic Russians and safeguarding its security needs. Russia views NATO-EU expansion into countries once in its sphere of influence as threatening its security. It resists Ukraine aligning with the West, given the two countries' historical ties and view of Ukrainians as a fraternal people. Ex-Soviet states like the Baltics strongly back Ukraine, recalling the aggression they faced from Moscow. Ukraine faces a difficult balancing act between its Soviet-era ties with Russia and desire for integration with Europe. Debates continue around whether the West should have been more considerate of Russian security concerns regarding NATO expansion near its borders. Charges that Ukraine has neglected the concerns of its Russian-speaking minority are met with allegations those grievances are exaggerated to justify interference. The notion of spheres of influence also clashes with ideals of self-determination in a globalized world. Russia claims that it is denazifying Ukraine, but independent observers largely reject claims of widespread Nazism in Ukraine's government or society. Ukraine did experience a nationalist movement centered in the West during World War II, with some factions briefly aligned with Hitler's invading forces. But Ukraine suffered greatly under Nazi occupation, and Ukraine today has a democratically elected government without a far-right mandate. There are indeed documented links between some Ukrainian volunteer brigades and ultra-nationalist groups, but these groups account for a marginal fraction of Ukraine's armed forces, and the military recruitment draws from across the political spectrum. Most experts assess that Ukraine's elected government does not support far-right extremism, even if fringe units with concerning histories exist. Russia accuses Ukraine's military of committing atrocities against ethnic Russian citizens in eastern breakaway regions. However, human rights groups dispute the scale and systematic nature of these alleged abuses, noting that violations have occurred on both sides amidst the fog of war. Observers assess that abuses likely represent rogue units or individuals within Ukraine's military, not organized policy. Russia utilizes accusations of atrocities to undermine Ukraine's moral authority, while Ukraine maintains that unverified reports are being distorted for propaganda. Independent verification remains challenging in the contested region. Moving forward, misconduct allegations should be fully investigated. Regardless of validity or isolated nature, reconciliation requires accountability for any credible abuse claims. Some argue that neither Ukraine nor Russia can achieve a decisive or lasting victory in this conflict. For Russia, fully subduing Ukraine by force would require a massive, costly occupation facing ongoing resistance. Ukraine likely lacks the military strength to retake all occupied territories. This creates an environment where the conflict could drag on indefinitely. As a result, the conflict may come to be seen as a stalemate where both sides lose. Continued fighting threatens Ukraine's statehood, drains Russia's resources, damages the world economy, and benefits no one long-term. This perspective suggests that ultimately, both sides must compromise through diplomacy to end a war that cannot be won militarily or politically. After over 8 years, the complex war in Ukraine continues, with no end in sight. This conflict has far-reaching consequences, destabilizing security in Europe, disrupting global energy markets, and escalating tensions between Russia and the West. Some in the West see benefit in prolonging the conflict to drain Russia's resources, while others see prolonged conflict as damaging. While the path ahead remains uncertain, the way forward must be through diplomacy and revived peace negotiations based on compromise. All sides must summon the political will to implement the Minsk agreements in good faith. The international community, including bodies like the UN and OSCE, must maintain pressure on all parties to reach a negotiated settlement. Ultimately, peace will require acknowledging the legitimate concerns of all sides, while upholding international law and Ukrainian sovereignty. The alternative of continued conflict, potential escalation into a wider war, and ongoing human suffering is untenable. The future security and stability of Eastern Europe, Russia, and the world depends on ending this war through diplomacy.